good morning, good afternoon to all of you. And if I don't want to forget this, Chag Sameach, a good Passover to all of you. And thank you for staying the course. Last week, I spoke to you about the war that Hitler won. That is, he made Eastern Europe almost virtually Judenrein. We spoke about the Einsatzgruppen, we spoke about collaboration and so on. Now we turn to the West. And again, you remember I told you, I've said it many times, you cannot explain the present by the present. Everything has a past. So this is the present that we're going to talk about. Sometime between the summer of 1941 and December of 1941, Adolf Hitler made the decision to murder all of the Jews of Europe. He had taken care of the Jews of Eastern Europe. Now he turns his attention to the Jews in the rest of the continent. That's what he wanted to do. He communicated this verbally. There is no Hitler Befehl, no command that is written down on paper by Adolf Hitler to murder the Jews. What we have is the memoir literature, the testimony at Nuremberg of various people, including, well, Goering will commit suicide, but he is reputed to have told people, the Fuhrer told me. Commandant Heuss, the commandant of Auschwitz, said, the Fuhrer told me. Himmler said, the Fuhrer told me. Meine Herren, it is time to settle accounts with the Jews. Hitler came close to saying that publicly to a group of Gauleiters, Nazi party officials in December of 1941, when he said, we are going to really settle things with the Jews. And that was a fulfillment of the promise that he had made on January 30th of 1939, before the war. In a rambling speech, I made mention of this to you, I think in the first lecture, Hitler said, I warned the Jews, you started World War I, you destroyed Germany. If you start World War II, it is not Germans that will die, the Jews will be eliminated from Europe. That's the thrust of what he is saying. Now in 41, he makes the decision. And you also remember, I had told you that there was the phenomenon seen early, even before the war. That phenomenon of German officers, Nazi officials marching towards the Fuhrer. What that meant was a belief. We know what our Fuhrer wants. It is our job to work it out, to implement it. And so, once again, sometime between late summer and December of 41, the Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler, makes the decision. On January 20th of 1942, in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, in a villa in Wannsee that had formerly been owned by a Jew, there is a meeting that is held, a very fateful meeting. Heydrich presides over the meeting, remember, the deputy head of the SS, or the blonde beast, the head of the Gestapo, and the man who takes notes at the meeting is Adolf Eichmann, head of Section 4B4 of the Reich Security Main Agency. They have come specifically to work out the details of murdering the Jews of Western Europe. Please keep in mind that in the spring of 1940, the Nazis had invaded Belgium and the Netherlands, moved into France, and by the middle of June of 1940, Western Europe was in German hands. And now the decision, again at Wannsee, or the decisions that are made, it is now time to implement the final solution in Western Europe. That's the present. That's the present that we're talking about. Now we talk about the history of the Jews in France very briefly, and then move into the Holocaust. On September 27th of 1791, the French Parliament had, for the first time in the continental European history, declared, first country to do it, that the Jews were equal with everybody else, that liberté, égalité, and fraternity applied to the Jews as well. The slogan coined by a French parliamentarian was, to the Jews as a people, nothing. To the Jews as Frenchmen, everything. That was a call to French Jews where we're going to emancipate you. But keep in mind, your loyalty has to be to France. There should be no talk about returning to Palestine. No speaking of Yiddish anymore. No speaking of Hebrew. French is the language. French is your culture. French is your country. And the result is going to be that, in fact, what's going to take place is that French Jews are going to be emancipated. There are a small number of them, probably several tens of thousands, that's all, in a country of 25 to 30 million. And the result is going to be that French Jews highly assimilated in the universities, in banking, in the professions. French Jews did very, very well. So well, in fact, that a Russian Jew in the 1880s will write back for a Russian Jewish newspaper, "I saw something that you'll never see in Russia," he said. "I went to a wedding. A French Jew, a man was getting married. He was in military uniform. He was an officer in the French army, an officer in the French army. No Jew could be an officer in the Russian army. He was in military uniform. It was a real gala, and many of his friends were there. His officer compadres, they were there. Many of them were not Jewish. They were in uniform." It talked about, again, the emancipation. It speaks to the emancipation of Jews and their integration into French society. But there was another France that thought that the Jews had come too far too fast, that the Jews had too much control over French society. The man who wrote about this, and his book, La France Juive, Jewish France, went through many, many printings, and probably several 100,000 Frenchmen and women actually read the book. Edouard Drumont, the author of the book, said, "The Jews are like an octopus. Their tentacles are everywhere in France. They control the banks, they control the schools, they control the culture, they control everything. We have to put them in their place." And then came the ill-fated Dreyfus affair. Again, a Jew was accused of betraying military secrets to the hated Germans. It splits France in half. And again, something you may not know, not only did it split France in half, it really split the French artistic community in half. Some of those impressionists that we all study and we all look at, they split. The worst of them all was Degas. Degas hated the Jews. Hated Dreyfus, hated the Jews. Degas, Renoir, and Cézanne. These were the great impressionists that stood against Dreyfus and stood against the Jews. So it splits French society right down the middle. But the French Jews were emancipated. There's no reversal of the emancipation, although the anti-Dreyfusides are calling for that. Comes the war, there's the Union Sacrée, everybody joins together to save France, and the war is over, the Jews resume their place. Comes the 1930s. Again, the Depression, banking scandals. A number of Jews are involved in, one particular is involved in the banking scandal. Anti-Semitism grows by leaps and bounds. And then there's something else that should strike a respondent chord as we are here at the end of March in the year 2026. A number of German Jews had fled Germany and came to settle in France. They were vehemently anti-Nazi. And they warned the French Jewish community, and they warned France itself. This guy, Hitler, he's a bad guy. You better watch out for them. Now, keep in mind, France had lost so many men in World War I. 1,336,000 Frenchmen had been killed. Millions more had been maimed during the war. France, a wave of pacifism had swept over France. And the Jews are now accused. Again, listen to this carefully. The Jews are now accused of trying to drag France into a war with Germany. And again, pacifists, people on the left who did not want war, people on the right who didn't want war. Nobody wanted war. And then in their eyes, the Jews are sucking France into another war with Germany in order to really alleviate the situation for Jews in Germany. That was not true. These people are doing, as there were people in France, watch out for Hitler, watch out. Germany is on the march. We've made too many compromises. Munich to Sudetenland, all of that. Be wary of the Germans. But the charge, remember, how many times have I said to you, perception is reality. The charge in France is that the Jews are out to suck us into another war. And the hatred of foreigners is so great that even before the war begins on September 1st, 1939, even before the war, a number of foreign Jews were actually interned, placed in French prisons, because they were too vociferous in their anti-German attitudes. So this is France on the eve of the war. In a course in World War II, I would speak, and I think I did give you a course in World War II, I spoke to you about the stunning German victory over France. France had fought for 4.5 years in World War I, 4.5 years, and France emerged victorious. And remember, I think I mentioned this to you before, when World War I was over, World War I was over, when French generals were asked, when they were asked, what mistakes did you make? And the answer that was given was, we underestimated the resilience of the French people and the French army. We thought they would cave as we took a large part of France and impacted a number of millions of casualties upon them. We thought they would cave in. They didn't cave in. But in 6 weeks' time, France went down to defeat. By the middle of June, June 14th, actually, of 1940, Paris was occupied. Absolutely unbelievable. And now, what's going to take place is, of course, the division of France. The man that the French people turn to, the man who takes command of France, everybody wants him. He's France's last and greatest surviving hero of World War I, Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain, P-E-T-A-I-N. Pétain now believes that the Germans not only have defeated France, they're going to win the war. Now what happens? Germany is going to win the war. Therefore, we have to accommodate ourselves to the Germans. And the result, this is Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain. He's the hero of Verdun, saved the French army at Verdun. So he's now in command, and he meets with Hitler, and they work out a deal. The deal is that 40% of France, 40% of France, Callie can take his picture down. France, again, France is divided. 40% of France is now known as the unoccupied zone. Its capital in Vichy is Vichy, a resort city in that part of France, and Pétain is its leader, and the prime minister is Pierre Laval, L-A-V-A-L. The Germans get most of the remaining part of France, including the city of Paris. A part of France near the Italian border, Nice, for example. That part is going to go to Mussolini. With France reeling back in defeat, Mussolini sends the Italian forces into France, in the area next to the Italian border. That's what led Franklin Delano Roosevelt to make that famous statement about Mussolini, that the hand that held the dagger stabbed France in the back. So there's an Italian zone, the unoccupied zone, but most of France goes to the Germans. What is most interesting here is that Vichy France becomes a den of iniquity, you could call it. It becomes an anti-Semitic place, a very anti-Semitic place. Some of the people, for example, who were involved in the Dreyfus Affair in the 1890s are still alive, and some of them are still alive. They come to Vichy. Vichy France takes an anti-Semitic position. In October of 1940, Vichy France establishes the Statutes on the Jews, in which the Jewish businesses are expropriated, Jews are kicked out of businesses, all sorts of things here are going to take place. It's not a pleasant position for the Jews in France. In fact, the anti-Semitic legislation in Vichy France begins even before the Germans begin to initiate anti-Semitic legislation in the occupied zone. And there is no evidence whatsoever, that the Germans forced Vichy to impose anti-Semitic legislation. The result is going to be the Jewish position here is very, very difficult. In the midst of all of this, now we will deal with this in another lecture, much later on in the lecture series, a number of people in the government send letters to the Vatican, send one particular letter to the Vatican, asking, is it right, what we are doing, we impose this anti-Semitic legislation, are we allowed to do this under canonical law, under canon law? Can we do this? And the answer that comes back, not clear who wrote the answer. Did Pope Pius XII write the answer? Don't know. But the answer could not have come back unless he knew about it. And so he remained silent on this, or maybe he really said it was the right thing to do. The answer that comes back is an interesting one. And the answer that comes back is, it's all right. The anti-Semitic legislation is all right, and a number of basic Catholic sources from an earlier period of time, from the medieval period, back up legislation against the Jews. The church draws a fine line, however, when it says no physical violence should be perpetrated against the Jews. But that's a very, very fine line here. So you have the statutes on the Jews, and then in the aftermath of that Wannsee conference that I spoke to you about, in the aftermath of that, Eichmann's representatives now come. Remember, he is one of the architects of the final solution. Adolf Eichmann, Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann, part of Section 4B4, he's the man that's going to deal with all of the countries, the occupied countries, the allied countries to Germany. He's the one that works out all the details about the deportation. His representatives come to Paris, they meet with Vichy people, Vichy representatives, and they work out a deal. The deal is, so what's important here, two very important things. Vichy agrees to the deportation of all foreign Jews living in France. The total number of Jews living in France, 350,000 out of a total French population of about 48 million. But of the 350,000 Jews, probably 150,000 had not gotten, for one reason or another, French citizenship. They got the equivalent of a green card. They were allowed to stay in France. No one forced them out. But now Vichy says that anybody who, let's say, who is not a French citizen is liable to be deported. And so the second part of that agreement is it's the French police that will do the rounding up. The Germans were struck for manpower in 1942. Remember, Operation Barbarossa had started on June 22nd of 1941. By the time we get to the early part of 1942, in the spring and summer of 42, the Germans are still on the offensive, but they're bogging down. And the number of troops that the Germans are allotting to Operation Barbarossa is growing. Tanks, planes, and troops are growing. The Germans are struck for manpower. If they want to round up the Jews, they've got to use indigenous elements. And so Vichy agrees that the French police, both in the occupied zone, in the occupied zone as well as the unoccupied zone, will participate in the rounding up of the Jews. It is the French police, remember what I told you before. I don't want to be condescending and I'm not being punitive. Remember what I told you before, that the war against the Jews was a pan-European phenomenon. 9,000 French police now round up foreign Jews. The most famous incident, of course, is the rounding up of French Jews in Paris, foreign Jews, July 17th, July 18th of 1942, when 12,884 foreign Jews are rounded up and placed in the Veldiv, the bicycle stadium within Paris. They are rounded up, and from there, in horrible conditions, absolutely horrible conditions, bad sanitation, all sorts of things. Very, very little food is allocated to them. And they eventually are going to be sent to a number of French prison camps. You can call them French concentration camps. Vichy had set them up, or the French government actually had set them up before the war, and now they're used to house these 12,884 Jews. The most famous of them, and the one from which nearly most French Jews are going to be deported to Auschwitz, is the concentration camp known as Drancy, D-R-A-N-C-Y. The next time you go to Paris, have a wonderful time, eat the great food, see the wonderful museums, see the beautiful churches, but take a trip or ask the tour guide to take you to Drancy. It's an important place in Jewish history. Most of the French Jews, about 77,000 French Jews, will be deported to Auschwitz out of 350,000 Jews. 77,000 will be deported to Auschwitz, and probably less than 3,000 will actually return. And most of them that were deported to Auschwitz really are going to go through Drancy. So the French police play a major role here. And when all is said and done, however, the survival rate of French Jews is quite good. 350,000 Jews, 75,000 dead. What does that come? That's 25%. You do the percentage, you do the mathematics here. Most French Jews, 75% of French Jews survived the Second World War. Why is this the case? Now, there are a number of things that can be said here. And remember, again, as I've told you so many times, this is not mathematics and science. You look at the data, you look at the memoir literature, you look at the people who are involved, you look at the post-war trials, and you come up, again, with some not definitive speculation, but some accurate, I think, for all intents and purposes, accurate speculation. Item number one. When the foreign Jews were rounded up, many, if not most, French Jews had come to the conclusion, eventually it's going to be our turn. We go into hiding. Remember, I told you this in connection with the Holocaust in Poland. The war and the Holocaust in particular is a time when you have to make decisions. And unlike our time, the decisions are irrevocable. If you decided to go into hiding in France, you stood a good chance of you're going to survive the war. If you believed, as many people in France did, a number of Jews in France did, the French people will not destroy us. We are French people. They may be anti-Semitic, but they will not lead to our destruction. They will not do it. When we get to Hungary, you'll see that many Hungarian Jews felt the same way. Anti-Semitism, yes, but we are Hungarian citizens. Hungary will not act in any way to deprive us of our lives. So many French Jews did that, but the overwhelming majority of French Jews did go into hiding. And also, again, at the very same time, there was the intrinsic decency of large numbers of French people, non-Jews, who took Jews into hiding. That is, they sheltered them in their families. Remember, on the one hand, there's liberté, égalité, and fraternité, the tradition of the French revolutionary liberalism. That is the Declaration of the Rights of Man in August of 1789, declaring that everyone in France, again, was equal to everybody else. The emancipatory laws of September 1791, the belief that French Jews had fought so honorably in World War I. All of this is going to come to play. On the other hand, there are the anti-Semites. One doesn't want to romanticize this. The slogans of Vichy France, of Marshal Pétain, was instead of liberté, égalité, and fraternity, work, homeland, and family. Work, homeland, and family. And again, this is going to lead to a number of, again, French police collaborating, and the fidelity, the loyalty they had to Marshal Pétain. Now, let me just stop here and tell you, if you like your history through literature and through film, there are some very, very good films that deal with the Holocaust in France. The most difficult one to take, but it's a good film based on a book, is the film Sarah's Key. Sarah's Key is a film that deals especially with the roundup of the Jews on July 17th and 18th, and they're placing in the Veldiv. Then there's a more romantic film called The Last Metro, The Last Metro. Then there's The Two of Us, again, and then there's, my French is not that good, Au revoir, mes enfants. That's a very, very good film dealing with a number of, the rounding up of a small number of French Jewish children in a school. So, if you like to take your history through film or literature, these are the films that you should be watching. There is also, but this is, I used to show it to my students, it's a 4.5-hour film that some people consider to be the best documentary that ever was made. It's called The Sorrow and the Pity. It was a film that was banned in France for a period of time because it spoke about French collaboration. So there is a part there that deals with the rounding up of the French Jews and the attitude of the French people towards this. And then there is a marvelous series, an absolutely marvelous series. It's in French with English subtitles, A French Village. It goes on, I think, for 5 or 6 seasons. It is absolutely wonderful, dealing with a French village under German occupation. And there is a significant part of that series deals with the situation of French Jews in the particular village. So it's very, very good. So here we are, the roundup of the Jews taking place, and the situation is very, very difficult. One has to ask the question, why do so many French Jews survive? I already answered some of this. Again, French Jews go into hiding, and they're right, because eventually the French police, in particular the Germans, are going to demand all French Jews go. But by this time, French Jews have gone into hiding. The French situation, the French population, by and large, don't romanticize this, The French population is sympathetic to the Jews, and France is a large country. Outside of the Soviet Union at this period of time, the only country in Europe that was larger than the American state of Texas was France. France is a fairly large country, mountainous regions, wooded areas, and French Jews can go into hiding. There was also the situation of Jews in the Italian zone. Now, I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm not going to get into this. All I can tell you is that during the Second World War, any Jew who was hiding out for the Germans, if he or she could get himself or herself into territory that was occupied by the Italian army. Remember, the Italians are really, up until 1943, allies of the Germans. Italian soldiers, Italian government officials in the areas in, for example, in Slovenia, in what was called at Yugoslavia at the time, in the eastern part of France. Remember that part that we spoke about, the area that is taken by Mussolini. Whatever Mussolini thought about the Jews, we'll talk about that next week. But Italian generals, Italian military people will not deport the Jews. They will not turn the Jews over to the Germans. So then again, Jews in the Italian zone have to make a decision. They know what's happening in the occupied zone and in the unoccupied zone. That is Vichy France and of course the German occupied zone. What do you think? You're living in Nice, you're living in Marseille. What do you think? Will it eventually happen here? And it did in fact happen here because the Germans take over the Italian zone when Italy pulls out of the war. But large numbers of Jews living in that zone are going to go into hiding. So again, Jews go into hiding everywhere, wherever they can. The country is a large one, and the Italians do as they do. And then there is, I call the French people act for the most part in a decent fashion. And then the church in France. Some very courageous members of the hierarchy. Archbishop Salège, for example, the Archbishop of Toulouse, stands on the altar, and says that the deportation of Jews is an unchristian thing to do. This is the wrong thing to do, and every decent Christian should come to he comes as close as to saying that every decent Christian should come to the assistance of the Jews. That's powerful stuff. And the underground, unlike the Polish underground, which was very ambivalent towards the Jews, had a different strategy and a different timetable in dealing with the Germans. In France, the French underground was very sympathetic to the Jews. In fact, the French don't like to talk about this. There is, at the beginning of the underground, probably half of the people in the French underground were Jews. Later on, of course, as the French begin to turn against the Germans. The great myth in France, incidentally, is that Germans occupy France. This is a myth. Everybody lives by Bubamites. This is a Bubamite in France. The Bubamites in France is the Germans occupied France. Charles de Gaulle fled to London, got on the radio and told all the French people they will have nothing to do with the Germans, don't collaborate. The French underground began to attack the Germans. That's a crock, an absolute crock. In reality, the French population, because of its, let's say, the support, the admiration they had for Marshal Pétain, fell into line. It's only when the deportation of Jews began to take place and when the Germans began to round up large numbers of French men and women, particularly French men, and put them in labor camps in Germany, then French population, French attitudes towards the Germans changed, and the French begin to go into the underground. But for a good part, for the first part of the war in German-occupied France, a good part of the underground was composed of Jews. And the underground at all times was sympathetic to the Jews. They didn't shoot Jews, they allowed Jews to enter the underground, and so on. And then the church, the underground, the decency of the French people, all of these things, Jews go into hiding, all of these things are going to play a role in the saving of 75% of the French Jews. Now, Pétain will be placed on trial, sentenced to death. He was 86 or 87 at the time when he's placed on trial. He was France's greatest war hero, so they commute that to life imprisonment. Pierre Laval, the prime minister, he's accused of treason and he's going to be executed. One can ask the question, it's a very interesting question to ask. Did the French police and did Laval and Pétain, did they know what the fate of the Jews was? Pétain, I think the evidence would appear, he knew what was happening. They were sent to the east and they were getting killed. And Laval knew that as well. Did the French police know Should they be exonerated? Are they innocent? And the answer, I think, is no. They probably did not know what was happening in Auschwitz, that when they were sending people to the East. But what they were doing is they were rounding up people, men, women, and children, innocent men, women, and children. Even though they were foreign Jews, they were human beings. They were taking them away, taking French citizens away. They were taking these people away, depriving them of their property, sending them, put them on packed trains, sending them to unknown places in the East. That's a crime. And only years later, 50, 60 years later, after the end of the Second World War, people in the French railroad system, people among the French police will apologize for what they had done. But apologies don't bring back the dead. There was a good deal of complicity. But again, just to repeat myself, the greatest manifestation really of, let's say, of French decency is going to take place, again, it's not the only place, but the most famous is a town that has a long name. I'll call it by its first name, Chambon. This was a town inhabited nearly exclusively by French Protestants. They will shelter hundreds, maybe several thousand Jews during the war. Even though there were people in Chambon that didn't particularly care for Jews, no one spilled the beans. The Germans come into Chambon again and again. They torture the mayor. They horribly torture him. He does not divulge anything. And the Jews who are in Chambon are going to be saved. Now, we have many grievances against the French that go back a long time. But the fact of the matter is going to be that the French record during the Holocaust, by and large, is a good one. Once again, 75% of the French Jewish community survived the war. 25% do not. Most do survive for all of the reasons that we've gone over. Now I turn my attention to Belgium. There were in Belgium 68,000 Jews living in Belgium out of a population of 8.3 million people. Small number of Jews, but the interesting thing here is that most of that 68,000 were foreign Jews. They were the most vulnerable. Foreign Jews are usually the most vulnerable people. They are stateless people. Stateless people have no support, no assurance, no protection everywhere. And yet the record in Belgium is, again, a fairly good one. Out of the 66 to 68,000 Jews, I don't want to romanticize this or exaggerate it, 28,000 Jews were deported. Out of the 28,000 Jews that were deported, 2,200 returned. So we are talking about probably, let's say, somewhere around 55% of the Belgian Jewish community survived the war. Not a bad record when you compare it with Eastern Europe, where, again, remember, for the 15th time already, I told you that's the war that Hitler won. These Jewish population, center of gravity of Jewish life on the planet is wiped out. In Belgium, again, 55% of the Jews are going to survive. Why is it that they survive? Again, we can't be precise here. I will suggest a number of things to you. Because many of the Jews in Belgium were foreign Jews, had experienced anti-Semitism, they were very, very distrustful of the authorities, both Belgian authorities and German authorities. Many Belgian Jews went into hiding early on. That's going to save their lives. There was an indigenous anti-Semitic movement in Belgium. They were called the Rexes, R-E-X. They were called the Rexes. These are the people that actually carried out a pogrom again. They burned a synagogue to the ground. These were people that didn't like Jews. They are collaborators with the German authorities. So there is collaboration here, as there was collaboration virtually everywhere. But nonetheless, most Belgians are going to help the Jews. Most Belgians are going to help the Jews. Now, I'm going to mention something to you now. File it in the back of your mind for next week's lecture, because it's the opposite is going to prevail in the Netherlands. When the Germans came into a country in Western Europe, they relied on the bureaucrats, the civil servants. They called upon them to register the Jews, to turn over Jewish addresses, to do all the things that collaborators would do. In Belgium, in contrast to the Netherlands, Belgian civil servants did not collaborate with the Nazi occupiers. They did not do it. That's an important point. In the Netherlands, as we shall see, they do. We'll talk about that more next week. In Belgium, the civil authorities, the acting government, the civil bureaucrats, all of these people, by and large, do not collaborate with the Germans. They falsify papers. They do not turn over information. That's a good thing for the Jews in Belgium. The other thing is just simply a stroke of luck. Remember, my mother told me, I'm sure your mother's told you, if you don't have mazel in this world, you're dead in the water. If you don't have luck, you're dead in the water. Not by choice on the part of the Belgians or the Dutch. Here's an important point to keep in mind. The SS had the major role in German-occupied Holland. The SS dominated that Nazi-dominated Holland. In Belgium, it's the Wehrmacht, the German army. The German army controls Belgium. Now, these are not Vestal virgins that we're talking about. The Belgian army, as I told you last week, remember the Wehrmacht, the German army, in Operation Barbarossa, collaborates with the SS and actually murders Jews. Now, the Wehrmacht, again, in Belgium, is virulently anti-Semitic, but it is not as diligently anti-Semitic as was the SS in the Netherlands. So this is an important fact of life. The fact that Belgium is ruled by the German army, the Wehrmacht, not by the SS, is important. Again, Belgian Jews go into hiding. That's very important. Sympathy of the Belgian population. That's very, very important. And also, again, the king and queen of Belgium decided to stay in Belgium during the German occupation. Why people decided to stay in Belgium? Why people decide to stay when they had the opportunity to leave? That's always a very interesting question. Again, probably more within the realm of the psychoanalyst than the historian and the political scientist, but also has to do with their own feelings, their own basic ideology. So, in Belgium, the king and queen remain. The queen seems to have been sympathetic to the Jews and let it be known to people, however she could communicate this. I don't know how she could do it, probably by word of mouth, but it did spread. She's after all, she's the queen, that she was not sympathetic to the idea of the deportation of the Jews, and created the impression that Belgians, good, decent Belgians, should help the Jews in this period of crisis. In addition to that, there was the Polish government, the Belgian government in exile, in London. The prime minister of the Belgian government in exile, Hubert Prelot, is a real hero. Prelot got on the radio and he was listened to by many Belgians in German-occupied Belgium. And he tells them, doesn't mention the Jews, does not mention the Jews. What Prelot does do is he announces over the radio that all of the people who lost property during the war. Now, who loses property? The Germans Aryanize all Jewish property. They take away a lot of Jewish property, take away some Belgian property. And Prelot gets on the radio and says that everybody who has lost property will be, they will get money. They'll get money back, and they'll get their properties back after victory is attained. Now, implicit in this is, and everybody knows what he's talking about in Belgium, everybody knows, that those who are persecuting the Jews, you better worry, you're not going to profit by it. You're going to have to give it back and you're going to be prosecuted. He doesn't say it in those words. But this is a time when people understand nuanced language. They understand what, in fact, is taking place. And that may have played a role in leading a growing number of Belgians to really give support to the Jews. What also happens in Belgium is something that doesn't happen anywhere else in German-occupied Europe in the entire period of the Holocaust. The trains are rolling day and night, taking Jews to Auschwitz and all other extermination camps and to other ghettos. The trains are rolling overnight. Only in German-occupied Belgium is there an attack by an underground unit against a convoy filled with Jews going to Auschwitz. That's the famous 20th convoy, April 19th, 1943. A train is going through Belgium, loaded with French Jews, loaded with other people as well, but loaded with over 250 Belgian Jews. The underground attacks. The train is blown up. Good part of the locomotive is blown up. Jews scatter. And out of the 100, 250, 260 Jews on the train, 118 are able to escape and survive the war. There is nothing like this that takes place in German-occupied Europe. Only in Belgium, again, let's say you can say only 55% of the Belgian Jewish community survived the war, but everything is relative here, and given by East European standards, that's a pretty good record. And once again, it's only in Belgium that there is an attack upon a train carrying Jews to deportation. So, again, the Belgian record is a good one. Now, last point about collaboration here. Why do most people in German-occupied Europe just want to get on with their lives? And in German-occupied Europe, I think I said this to you last week, in German-occupied Europe, if you kept your mouth shut, if you were not Jewish, and you kept your mouth shut, didn't join the underground, didn't do anything against the Germans, the chances were great that you were going to survive the war. But some people go beyond that. They do more than keep their mouths shut. They collaborate with the Germans. There's all sorts of collaboration, what the French used to call horizontal collaboration. That is, a number of French women slept with German soldiers. They will pay a very, very heavy price when the war is over. I assume most of you are old enough. You saw some of the documentaries at the end of the war. You can still see these documentaries with French women who had slept with German soldiers. Their heads are shaved, they're paraded, they're spit upon, they're humiliated. And for decades, if that liaison between French women and German soldiers led to pregnancies and led to children, those children will suffer terribly, as Norwegian children will suffer terribly down into the 1960s and 1970s. No fault of their own. Their mothers, for whatever the reason, slept with German soldiers. And then there's an interesting case in France of Picasso. Picasso, remember the painting of Guernica, the most outstanding artistic demonstration, anti-fascist demonstration. Picasso spends the war in Paris. He spends the war in Paris. He doesn't flee. And not only doesn't he flee, the Germans patronize him. They go to his studio, they feed him, they do all sorts of things with him. Here's Picasso, the man who, again, supported the Republic against Franco, makes that great painting Guernica, the greatest testimony against, let's say, bombing of a town. And he stays for the war in France. And on the other hand, there's the black singer Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker just gets out of Paris right away and joins the underground. Why do people collaborate? Again, more for the psychoanalyst than it is for the historian or the political scientist. So we've come to France, 75% of the Jewish community survives. We've come to Belgium, 55% of the Jewish community survives. Smaller Jewish populations, highly integrated into their societies. These are all, and again, in addition to all the other reasons, again, these are why Jews in Western Europe, most of them are going to survive the war. The one exception in all of this is the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, out of about 140,000 Jews, 105,000, at least 105,000 Jews are going to die during the Second World War. The Dutch record is not a particularly good one. As to why that's the case, that's for next week's lecture. Once again, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for staying the course. We've had difficulties in the past. I am very, very grateful to you for staying the course here. We think we've worked these things out. And again, Chag Sameach, a happy and a good Passover to all of you. Callie, let it rip.
All right. Again, please put those questions in the chat if you do have any, instead of raising a hand. And let's start with, we had a question about after the war, what did France and Belgium do to, not the women, but the men who they knew had collaborated with the Nazis? And what percentage of the French population, if we know, actively collaborated?
All right, what happens to those collaborators in high places? They're going to be put in prison or they're going to be executed. It's as simple as that. As to the other question, the second question, what percentage of the French population, let's say, collaborate? I can't answer that question. We simply don't know. What we do know, what most historians would argue, is that in all of the German occupied areas, the overwhelming majority of the people did not resist and did not collaborate. They just went about their lives trying to feed their families and trying to protect themselves. The degree of collaboration is greater perhaps in Eastern Europe. That we can say, I think, truthfully, that we can say. And in terms of, let's say, physical violence, sexual exploitation, it's greater in Eastern Europe than it is in Western Europe. But there are very few innocent people here. When we get to Italy, I'll talk to you. Remember, I told you about the Italian army doing very good things, not deporting the Jews. But a number of Italian soldiers will sexually exploit Jewish women and girls. It happens everywhere. You know, this may come out the wrong way. You put men in charge of women, you're going to get sexual exploitation. As the night follows the day, it's going to happen. And I must tell you, painful though it may seem to you, even in Jewish partisan units, fleeing from the Germans, in the forests, in the mountains of Poland and Lithuania, Belarus and Ukraine, in Jewish partisan units, an unmarried woman, a single woman, an unmarried woman, single woman, widow, what didn't make any difference, would have to find what is called a forest uncle, a Jewish partisan that would find shelter for her, make sure that she had food and so on, and the price that that woman would have to pay. The memoir literature is clear on this, not from the men's memoir literature, but from female literature, Holocaust survivors in the forest. An unmarried woman would be very, very vulnerable to sexual exploitation. So the exploitation takes place everywhere. It's only a chapter in Holocaust historiography that we have recently begun to investigate. Go ahead, Kelly.
Okay. So obviously we're focused mostly on the Jewish angle here, but how did France and Belgium approach, the governments and the people approach other groups that were targeted during the Holocaust?
In France and in Belgium, the only other group that is going to be targeted are the gypsies. Gypsies are going to be targeted, and they're going to be roundups of gypsies. We believe, again, because it's the Holocaust, I'm talking primarily about, almost exclusively about Jews, we believe, we're not sure of this, we are not sure that about 1 million gypsies are killed during the war by the Germans. Now, that may be too high a figure. But here, again, to show you the disparity, but to show you that the gypsies are caught up in this. In Auschwitz, as we shall see in another lecture, 1 million, probably 1,100,000 people were killed at Auschwitz. 900,000 were Jews. The rest were non-Jews. And including among the non-Jewish population that was murdered at Auschwitz, there were 21,000 gypsies that were murdered at Auschwitz. Now, Nazi policy towards the gypsies is very, very strange. It's crackpot biology. The Nazis believed that some of the gypsies were pure gypsies. And in fact, they were really Aryans. And some gypsies were actually conscripted into the German army, into the Wehrmacht. Some German gypsies actually fought for the Germans. But most gypsies, Himmler made this incredible, just crazy stuff. Most of the gypsies were vagrants, bad people, sexual deviants, and of course, mongrels in terms of their race. They could be deported, they could be shot on the spot, and they could be executed, and many of them were. Now, the other group, of course, that I did not mention, again, but these people were, for the most part, or at least they stood a better chance of hiding, were homosexuals. Homosexuals are always targeted. They wear the pink triangle. In Auschwitz, they will wear the pink triangle. And so in those places where the Germans could discern that they were homosexuals, they're going to be incarcerated. But they are not going to be sent to the gas chambers unless they oppose the regime in any possible way. With the exception of those 21,000 gypsies that are in Auschwitz. They go I'll use that terrible colloquial expression of the time, they go up the chimney.
Oy,
Go ahead.
okay. Okay, now there are other governments or monarchies that did take a more public stand. Why didn't the Belgian monarchy, especially if the Queen was sympathetic, take a more public stand against the Nazis?
Why don't other people take a more public stand against the Nazis? The answer is very simple. They'd
Well,
get
except
killed. They would get killed. Or they would be incarcerated, and that would be it.
okay, yes, but we were talking about how they could have, left the
They,
country
they could
and
have they could have spoken out. But
right.
let me tell you, there's a statement in the Talmud. Uh, don't judge anyone until you've stood in the other shoes. Got to be very, very careful here. Very, very careful about judging people during the Holocaust. I've tried to say this to you before. Remember, again, I hope it came through in the last couple of weeks. I said to you, if I were a Polish Catholic in German-occupied Poland during the war, and if a Jewish family came to me and said, would you shelter me? I'm not sure I would. Remember the penalty. Now, the penalty in France and Western Europe is not Auschwitz for sheltering a Jew. It's incarceration and probably sent to Dachau. But you would suffer. In the eastern part of Europe, you're dead, your family is dead. There are hundreds upon hundreds of Poles that will be executed by the Germans because they shelter Jews. You must remember this. It's very, very important here. I'll give you an example. Well, I'll save it for next week. What it takes to shelter a Jew. Remember, I use the term the asymmetry. You hate the Jews. You want to collaborate. You make an anonymous telephone call to the Gestapo. In any city occupied by the Germans. In such and such a building, in such and such a place, there are Jews living. That's all you do. You make a telephone call. You want to give your name? If you want there's always a reward for informing upon Jews. You want the reward, you give your name. That's all you got to do. To save a single Jew. You have a Jew, you take a Jewish child in. All of a sudden, you got to buy more food. And the grocer asks you, why are you buying more food? Right? And then the Jewish boy goes to school, right? You got to send the kid to school, right? Why is there a kid on the farm? Why is there a kid in the apartment house that doesn't go to school? So you send the Jewish kid to school. The kid goes to the bathroom. Another non-Jewish kid sees that the kid is circumcised because nobody else in Europe except Bosnian Muslims or in Albania, where there are Muslims, is anybody circumcised. You're dead. You're dead meat. Or as Howard Drugotsky used to know, as he used to say in Brooklyn, you're dead as Clancy's nuts. It's as simple as that. So you got to be careful here. You must be very, very careful on judging people here. I like to think, while I might not have taken a Jewish child in or a Jewish family in, I would not have raped a Jewish girl. I would have not taken money stored. I would not have informed. I might not have done this. But into whether I would actually move in the direction of helping Jews when the penalty for doing such is so great, be very, very careful on making judgments.
Okay. Now you talked about Belgian reparations a little bit. What about in France?
There are no reparations given in France to French Jews. There are no reparations given to Belgian Jews. The property goes back to them. That is, if it's possible. But it's always very difficult, whether you're particularly in Eastern Europe. Heaven help the Jewish family that survived the Holocaust in Poland and comes out of the camps or comes out of the sewers, come out of the forest, and goes to their home where there's now a Gentile family or Polish family living in it and says, I used to live here. It's my property. They're lucky if they come out alive on that. They're lucky if they come out alive. To this day, I know a number of Polish Jewish survivors. They know well indeed they're not going back to Poland. They're certainly not going back to Poland to live. But if they want to claim their property, they're not going back physically to get it. A number of Jews were killed after the war because they tried to get their property back. In France, people have moved into Jewish housing. By and large, most French Jewish survivors are being able to get their property back. Most of them are going to get their property back. So it's a different situation. They're not going to be killed by the French people if they want their property back. But some of them are going to have a difficult time. They have to go to court to get it back. And you find all over Europe, people are going to say, hey, how did you come back? Well, what did you do? Pay off the Germans. What did you do? Did you collaborate with them? Did you reform upon other Jews and so on? People who come back and want their property back, they're always going to be under suspicion by the people who remained in the country. Go ahead, Kelly.
How does D-Day affect French sentiment towards the war, especially in Normandy?
All right, now listen very carefully, please. I'm not being condescending here. This is really a tough call here. Before the war, before D-Day, Eisenhower is told by his intelligence people and by British intelligence, you got to knock out the railroad system and the railroad depots in order to prevent the Germans from bringing up their forces to the beaches. Intelligence also tells Eisenhower, if you bomb the railroad lines, as we're telling you, bomb the depots, tens of thousands of French people are going to die. Churchill is reluctant to do it. Some generals are reluctant to do it. Eisenhower says you got to do it. Eisenhower asks Roosevelt, what do we do? And Roosevelt says, you got to do it. Anything that saves American soldiers has got to be done. And we bomb. We bomb the French railroad lines, depots, and we may kill somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 French civilians. So some French civilians are very antagonistic to us, but most of them see American soldiers as liberators. That's the attitude. And the French underground plays an important role in disrupting communications between the Germans in the interior of France and indeed the ones that are fighting on the beaches. That plus, again, that's going to help us a great deal here. We are also helped a great deal by Enigma or Ultra. We have broken the German code, which means that we know the orders from Berlin. We know those orders from Berlin to German generals before the German generals get them. So what's going to happen is the French underground turns against the Germans. French sympathy, for the most part, looks upon the American, British, Canadian, and French soldiers who are coming on the beaches as liberators. And the Germans are going to respond very harshly. The most famous incident is going to be at Oradour. That's a French village. The Germans are retreating. An underground, French underground, attacks the German retreating soldiers near the town of Oradour. The Germans round up hundreds of French women and children, put them in the church in Oradour, burn the church to the ground. That's what the Germans do in France. But here again, keep in mind, so you get the broad view of what's taking place here. The two most famous places of German atrocities against civilians in German-occupied Western and Central Europe. Lidice in Czechoslovakia, where the town is wiped out, nearly all of the town is wiped out, because it is believed that those who helped kill Heydrich, an underground unit kills Heydrich, near Prague, that town is wiped out, and Oradour in France. Let me tell you, as I tried to tell you before, there were 10,000 towns and villages in German-occupied Europe. In Ukraine, in Poland, Belarus, they are destroyed by the Germans. So the difference here is very, very great. It's better to be a Jew, better to be a non-Jew in Western Europe than it is to be living in German-occupied Europe, in Eastern Europe. Go ahead, Callie.
The last question, sorry, is when it comes to Holocaust education, many of the details that you have provided in the last few weeks, and today especially, are maybe not the ones that are normally discussed. Why is that, and how, in your opinion, does the curriculum get determined?
All right, first of all, I'll give you a tribute to Ari Katz, who decided that we should have an 8-week series on the Holocaust. I mean, that you want to know some of the things that people are not taught usually. Now, the problem with the Holocaust, teaching the Holocaust, is twofold, two problems. One, you have to deal with the collaboration. No country wants to highlight its bad points in history. So how do you talk about the Holocaust if you're in France The collaboration with Vichy was great. Most French people, up until 1943, the real turning point is Stalingrad. When the Germans lose at Stalingrad in the Soviet Union, people are on the fence. People who didn't care. All of a sudden, they come to the conclusion that the Germans are going to lose the war. But up until that time, many people collaborated with the Germans. And do you want to speak about that? Do you want to talk about this bad time? Do you want to, because some of these people are still alive. Do you want people to ask their grandparents, what'd you do during the war, Grandpa? So people don't like to highlight this type of thing. And continuing anti-Semitism, they go, who gives a damn about the Jews? We all suffered during the war. Look, even in our own country's educational system. How many of you knew about the pogrom that took place in Tulsa after World War I? When a black neighborhood, black soldiers in American Army uniforms are burned alive in this period of time. Did you learn this in high school? I didn't learn this in high school. That's American racism coming to the fore. We don't talk about these things. And then the other thing is the implementation. You know who does the heavy work in education? Not people like me. My job is an easy job. What, I teach 8 hours a week? Yeah, I do research and I meet with the students. You know who does the heavy work in American education? Anybody who teaches K through 12. These people deserve, these men and women deserve every dollar that they get. They have behavioral problems. They're teaching 5 or 6 hours a day, 4 to 6 hours a day. They have a monumental curriculum. So even when a state, I worked on the state, New York State curriculum for Holocaust education. We put out a very, very good curriculum. Does the teacher allocate an hour to it? 2 hours? A day? A week? They don't. It's not their fault. It's not their fault. They are overloaded. Look, I have a daughter that teaches in the New York public school system. If you have anybody that teaches in the public school system, you know how hard these people are working. They are working very hard. I know you criticize the summers off and so on, but you take it from me. You teach 5 hours a day in a New York City high school. You deserve X number of dollars beyond what you're getting. And that's true all across the United States. So the point in all of this is, even when the curriculum is good, even when there is no anti-Semitism and there is no racism, the time that you allocate is just very, very limited. Callie, I'll stay as long as you want.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. We do have to wrap it up, but as you know, there'll be an email that's coming out, and if there are any questions that weren't answered, that we can get answers in the email, that will be happening. And this is a great place to stop because that was a very, unique perspective on Holocaust education from someone who has created the curriculum. So I would like to thank everybody for being here. Please come back next week to learn about Mussolini and Italy and the Netherlands, I believe. And have an
Denmark.
amazing holiday. Hope everyone's seders are delicious. And thank you so much for being here, Professor Berk.
Thank you all. Shalom uvracha. Thank you very, very much for staying the course. Have a good holiday, all of you. Bye-bye.